The summer of 1884 hit Willow Creek like a dry cough, all dust and quiet desperation. It was the kind of town people ended up in, not the kind they chose. And that evening, two strangers were about to find out they had more in common than just bad luck. They were both running from something. They just didn't know it yet. Breck Holloway swung down from a horse that looked as tired as he felt. He was 38, but the last 3 years had aged him a decade. Dodge City was a long way behind him, and with it, every cent he'd ever made. $43. That's what was left, sewn into the lining of his vest. The price of trusting a woman named Veronica Whitmore. The shame of it was a constant bitter taste in his mouth. At that exact second, the stagecoach rattled to a stop, sighing a cloud of dust onto the porch of Murphy's boarding house. A young woman stepped out. Blythe Crowder, 23 years old, with eyes as green and sharp as broken glass. Her dress was wrinkled from the trip, but her back was ramrod straight. She was the new school teacher, and the job was more than a paycheck. It was an escape route. An escape from a 70-year-old banker with a damp handshake and a possessive stare. They reached the top step of the boarding house at the same time. His spurs made a lonely, metallic sound. Her heels clicked with a sharp, determined rhythm. They didn't look at each other, but a current passed between them, the kind of silent hum that comes right before a lightning strike. The air grew thick. Something was about to happen. Mrs. Murphy, the owner, met them at the door. She was a round, flour-dusted woman with a kind face, but her smile evaporated when she saw the two of them standing there. "Oh, dear," she said, her hands fluttering to her apron. "Well, now, this is a pickle." She looked from Breck's hard, weathered face to Blythe's determined one. "Seems I've got a mix-up. 2 reservations, but only 1 room left." Breck's jaw tightened into a knot. He'd ridden for days, bone-weary and soul-sore. The thought of more trouble was like salt in a fresh wound. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough, "I sent a wire, paid a deposit." His pride was already hanging by a thread. He wouldn't let it snap now. Blythe stepped forward, her chin high. She wasn't about to be dismissed. "As did I, Mrs. Murphy. Or rather, the school board did. Weeks ago." She had fought too hard for this escape to be turned away at the door. She would sleep on the schoolhouse floor before she went back to St. Louis. Mrs. Murphy's face was a mess of apologies and confusion. She shuffled through a stack of papers on a small desk, her muttering about her husband's bookkeeping filling the tense silence. Finally, she looked up, her expression one of pure dread. "It's room 7, she said, as if pronouncing a sentence. "It's a fine room. Good mattress, a washstand." She trailed off, her eyes darting between them. "But there's only the 1 bed." The unspoken words hung in the air. One of them would have to go. One of them would be cast back out into the dust. "You'll have to share," she finally stammered, "or one of you will be sleeping in the barn." The barn, with the horses and the hay and the smell of manure. The indignity of it crashed over Breck. He was a rancher, or he had been. He was a man who'd once owned hundreds of acres and a fine house. Now he was being offered a pile of hay to sleep on. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "Absolutely not," Blythe said. Her voice was ice. "I am a school teacher. I will not be sharing my quarters with a strange man." She looked at Breck, at his dusty clothes and the gun on his hip, and saw everything she was supposed to be afraid of. A drifter, a rough man from a rough world. Breck's patience, already worn thin, finally broke. "And I'm not bunking with some prissy city girl who probably thinks a cow is something you read about in a book," he shot back, his voice dripping with scorn. He saw her fine, uncalloused hands and her straight-backed pride, and it reminded him of Veronica, of the soft words that hid a heart of stone. "Enough!" Mrs. Murphy's voice cut through their anger. She planted her hands on her hips, a formidable fortress of a woman. I won't have this bickering on my porch all night. Someone is sleeping in that room, and someone is sleeping in the hay. You two figure it out." She turned and disappeared back into the house, leaving them alone in the gathering dusk. The silence was a battlefield. Neither would give an inch. For two people who had lost almost everything, pride was the only currency they had left. It was a standoff between two kinds of stubborn, two kinds of desperation. Finally, Blythe spoke, her words clipped and sharp. "Fine," she said, though the word tasted like poison. "We will share the room." She looked him dead in the eye. "But there will be a divider, a curtain, and you will stay on your side. No exceptions." Breck gave a curt, sharp nod. "Agreed," he growled. "But don't expect me to start tipping my hat and asking your permission to breathe. I've got my ways, and they're not changing for some schoolmarm." It was a truce born of mutual disgust, a ceasefire in a war that had just begun. Mrs. Murphy led them up the creaking stairs to room 7. It was small, barely big enough for the one bed, a single chair, and a washstand. The window looked out over the town's only street, a lonely stretch of dirt and false-fronted buildings. The air was stuffy with the smell of old wood and lavender soap. She promised to bring up an extra blanket to hang as a curtain, and then left them alone, closing the door behind her with a quiet click. The sound of that click was like a cell door locking. They were trapped, together. The silence that filled the room wasn't empty. It was heavy, suffocating. It was filled with resentment and suspicion. And in that tiny room, under the dim light of a single kerosene lamp, the first battle for territory was about to begin. It didn't take long for the Cold War to turn hot. Breck, without a word, tossed his saddlebags onto the middle of the bed, a clear claim of ownership. Blythe stared at the worn leather for a long moment, her green eyes flashing. Then, with a deliberate, almost silent grace, she picked them up and dropped them onto the floor with a heavy thud. She then opened her own trunk and began laying out her nightgown and hairbrush on the quilt, her movements precise and territorial. "I paid for this room same as you," she said, her voice low and even as she unpinned her hat. She was marking her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "And I was here first," Breck retorted, which they both knew was a lie. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her. He was bigger, stronger, but she had a fire in her that he hadn't expected. It was intriguing and irritating as hell. That night, they slept in the narrow bed with a coarse wool blanket hung from a rope in the middle, a pathetic wall in a space too small for secrets. It did little to separate them. Breck slept in his clothes, one hand resting near the butt of his pistol. Blythe wore a high-necked wrapper buttoned all the way to her chin, her body as stiff as a board. Sleep was a shallow, restless thing, punctuated by the unfamiliar sounds of a stranger breathing just inches away. The real problems began before sunrise. Breck snored. Not a gentle rumble, but a deep, rattling sound like a freight train struggling up a steep grade. It vibrated through the mattress, through the very bones of the house. Blythe, in her sleep-deprived state, found herself kicking, her legs flailing in protest. Her foot connected sharply with his shin not once, but twice. The next morning, the room was thick with a hostility you could taste. "You're snoring," Blythe said, her voice tight with exhaustion as she tried to tame her tangled hair in the small, cracked mirror. "Could raise the dead from the local cemetery." "And you're kicking," Breck shot back, yanking on his boots with unnecessary force. "Could lame a pack mule." He glared at her reflection, at the dark circles under her eyes that mirrored his own. This wasn't going to work. It was a powder keg with a short fuse, and they were both holding a match. Their days fell into a rhythm of petty warfare. He would leave his gun belt, heavy and smelling of oil and leather, draped over the single wooden chair. She would move it, hanging it on a nail by the door, and then meticulously arrange her combs and silver-backed brushes on the washstand, where his razor had been. He was a creature of chaos, scattering his belongings like seeds in the wind. She was a being of absolute order, organizing his mess into neat, infuriating piles. "Must you be so particular?" he asked one morning, watching her fold his discarded shirt with a precision that bordered on surgical. The question was a low growl, a challenge. She didn't even look up. "Must you live like a barn animal?" she countered, picking up a pair of his dirty socks from the floor with 2 fingers, as if handling a dead rodent. But in this constant, simmering conflict, something else was happening, something neither of them wanted to admit. When Breck would stretch in the morning, the early light catching the hard lines of his body as his shirt rode up, Blythe would feel a strange, unwelcome heat creep into her cheeks. She would quickly turn away, her heart hammering against her ribs, and when she would bend to get something from her trunk, the fabric of her dress pulling taut across her hips, Breck would find his throat suddenly dry. He'd look away, cursing himself for noticing. They started to tease each other, the barbs still sharp but lacking their initial venom. The insults became a strange kind of language, a way of talking without saying anything that mattered. "You yawn like a stray cat," he'd say, a ghost of a grin playing on his lips. "And you eat like a starving wolf," she'd reply, but she couldn't quite hide the twitch of a smile. They were learning each other's rhythms, their habits, the small details that made up a person. And this unwilling intimacy was starting to feel less like a prison and more like something else, something dangerous. And then the storm came. It rolled in without warning, a bruised purple cloud that swallowed the afternoon sun. The first crack of thunder shook the boarding house to its foundations. Blythe, who had been reading by the window, woke from a light doze with a sharp, involuntary gasp, her hand flying to her throat. "Easy," Breck's voice came from the other side of the blanket curtain. It was dark in the room now, the world outside a chaotic symphony of wind and rain. "It's just a storm." "I know what it is," she whispered back, but her voice was thin and shaky. A lie. Another flash of lightning lit up the room in a stark, blue-white glare. In that split second, he saw her. She was pressed against the headboard, her eyes wide and dark with a terror that had nothing to do with the noise. It was a deeper, older fear. "Storms get to you," he stated, not a question. She managed a small, embarrassed nod in the darkness. "They always have." Another boom of thunder, louder this time, rattled the window pane. Without thinking, without considering the invisible line between them, Breck reached across the blanket. His hand found hers in the dark. Her fingers were like ice, and they were trembling. He wrapped his hand around hers, his grip firm and warm. "It's just noise," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Can't hurt you in here." But as the lightning flashed again, illuminating their clasped hands, Blythe saw something on his wrist, something the rolled-up sleeve of his shirt had exposed. A thin, white, jagged scar that looked like a lightning bolt itself. It was an old wound, but it was stark against his tanned skin. Her breath caught in her throat, and the thunder wasn't just noise to her anymore. It was the sound of shouting, the smell of smoke, the memory of a burning barn, of a man's angry face lit by flames. It was a memory she couldn't quite grasp, a phantom from a past she had tried to bury. She squeezed his hand tighter, not for comfort from the storm outside, but from the one that had just woken up inside her. They stayed that way for a long time, their hands locked together in the dark, 2 strangers bound by a terror neither of them understood. The blanket dividing them was still there, but the real walls between them were starting to crumble. And they both knew, when the sun finally rose, nothing would ever be the same. The morning after the storm, the air in room 7 was different. They didn't speak of what had happened, of their hands clasped in the dark. But the silence was no longer hostile. It was watchful, aware. When he handed her the coffee pot, their fingers brushed, and a jolt went through them both. They pulled back as if burned. The small room had suddenly become charged with an energy that was both terrifying and thrilling. 3 days later, Mrs. Murphy made an announcement at breakfast that would change everything. Her niece, Sarah, was getting married to the blacksmith's son. "The whole town's invited," she declared, beaming. "There'll be food and music and dancing, Saturday afternoon, at the church." Breck's first instinct was to say no. A wedding. The very word was a mockery of his own failed dreams. He planned on spending the day in the dark corner of the saloon, nursing a whiskey and his own bitter memories. But when Saturday came, he found himself standing in front of the cracked mirror, pulling on his cleanest shirt. He told himself it was just to get out of the stuffy room. It was a lie. Blythe spent an hour getting ready. She pinned her dark hair up in a way that exposed the graceful curve of her neck. She put on her best dress, a silk the color of a deep blue evening sky. It made her eyes seem even greener, more vibrant. She told herself she was just trying to look respectable for her students and their parents. That, too, was a lie. The church was buzzing with the cheerful energy of a small-town celebration. Breck got there first, melting into the crowd of men at the back, his hat pulled low. He felt out of place, a ghost at a feast. Then the church doors opened, and Blythe walked in. A hush fell over the room. It wasn't just him. Everyone turned to look. She moved with a confidence he hadn't seen before, her blue dress whispering against the wooden pews. She was beautiful, not just pretty, but breathtakingly, painfully beautiful. And a feeling twisted deep in Breck's gut, a raw, possessive feeling he had no right to. Their eyes met across the crowded room. For a long, breathless moment, the world fell away. There was only him, and there was only her. It was a silent acknowledgement of the storm, of the clasped hands, of the unspoken thing that now lived between them in room 7. Then, as if breaking a spell, Blythe lifted her chin, a mask of cool indifference sliding back into place, and took a seat with the other ladies. But her hands were trembling in her lap. The ceremony passed in a blur of hopeful words and sweet promises. Outside, under the vast Wyoming sky, the real party began. Fiddles sawed out a lively tune, and tables overflowed with food. Breck found a spot in the shade, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and he watched her. He watched Blythe as she talked and laughed with the other women. He watched as man after man, young and old, asked her to dance, and she accepted, her blue skirt swirling as she was spun across the makeshift dance floor. With every twirl, every laugh she shared with another man, the knot in Breck's stomach tightened. He shouldn't care. But he did. The trouble started, as it often does, with a tradition. The bride, Sarah, prepared to toss her bouquet. The unmarried women of Willow Creek gathered like hopeful birds, their hands outstretched. Blythe was pushed into the group by a laughing Mrs. Murphy. "Go on, dearie, you never know." Sarah turned her back and tossed the bundle of white roses and baby's breath high into the air. It sailed in a perfect arc, a symbol of future happiness tumbling through the bright afternoon sun. Blythe, caught up in the moment, jumped for it, her arms reaching. At the exact same instant, Breck moved. He didn't know why. It was pure instinct. He stepped out from the shadows, his own hand shooting up. Their fingers closed around the flower stems at the very same time. For a second, there was a stunned silence. Then, the crowd roared with laughter. "Let go!" Blythe hissed through gritted teeth, tugging the flowers toward her. Her face was bright red. "You let go," Breck growled back, his competitive spirit flaring. His grip was like iron. A ridiculous tug-of-war began. They pulled, they twisted, stepping closer and closer until they were chest to chest, their faces inches apart. White petals fluttered to the ground around them like snow. "This is absurd!" Blythe panted, trying to wrestle the mangled bouquet from his grasp. "You started it!" he shot back, but a grin was spreading across his face. He was enjoying this. He was enjoying her. With one final decisive tug from Breck, they both lost their balance. They tumbled backward together, a tangle of limbs and blue silk, landing in a heap on the soft grass. The crowd erupted. They lay there for a moment, stunned, the ruined bouquet still clutched between them. Then they looked at each other, and they started to laugh. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a deep, helpless, gut-wrenching laughter that shook their whole bodies. It was the laughter of two people who had been holding their breath for weeks and had finally let it out. "We must look," Blythe gasped, tears streaming down her face. "Like a pair of absolute fools." "Complete fools," Breck agreed, his voice hoarse with laughter. He reached out and gently picked a stray rose petal from her hair. And in that moment, lying on the grass, covered in flowers, the war was over. The walls hadn't just cracked. They'd come crashing down. As they walked back to the boarding house later, a comfortable silence settled between them. Their evening routine changed. The hostility was replaced by a tentative curiosity. She would read by the lamplight while he cleaned his guns, the scent of oil and paper mingling in the small room. He would tell her stories about cattle drives, about the vast, lonely beauty of the open range. She, in turn, started reading passages from her journal aloud. "The prairie wind carries secrets," she read one night, her voice soft in the quiet room. Stories of those who passed this way before. Their hopes scattered like seeds on the endless grass. Breck listened, mesmerized. He had lived his whole life on that prairie, but he'd never heard it described that way. "You have a way with words," he said, his voice filled with a genuine admiration that made her cheeks flush. It was during one of these late-night talks that they finally began to share the real pieces of themselves. He told her about Veronica, about the 3 years of lies that had ended in betrayal and financial ruin. "She left me with nothing," he said, the bitterness still sharp in his voice. "Wiped me clean out, took every last dime, sold off my stock, mortgaged my land right under my nose. I found out from the banker. The humiliation, it was worse than being poor." He shook his head, looking down at his scarred hands. 3 years of my life, gone, for a woman who was playing me from the start. He conveniently left out the part where Veronica and her new man had also robbed the Dodge City Bank, and that the sheriff suspected Breck was their inside man. He was a wanted man, not just a broken one. Blythe listened, her heart aching for the pain he tried so hard to hide beneath his anger. Then she told him her story. About the stifling world of St. Louis society, where a woman was a decoration. She told him about Harold Wickham, the powerful banker her father had promised her to. "He called it a merger," she said, her hands twisting in her lap. "My father's business for my hand in marriage. I was just part of the transaction." She stared at the flickering lamp flame. "He told me I should be grateful. A plain girl like me to catch such a wealthy man." She left out the real reason for the arrangement. She had been in her father's office late one night and had seen Wickham in a back alley meeting, had witnessed an exchange of money and a quiet murder of a business rival. The marriage wasn't a merger. It was a cage, a way for Wickham to buy her silence and her family's compliance. "Plain?" Breck's voice was incredulous. He scoffed. "Any man who calls you plain is a damn fool who needs his eyes checked." The words hung in the air between them, raw and sincere. A warmth spread through Blythe's chest, a feeling she hadn't realized she'd been starved for. Their shared confessions, even the incomplete ones, forged a new, powerful bond between them. The tiny room was no longer a prison, but a sanctuary. They started sharing meals Mrs. Murphy would send up, their knees bumping under the small table. He noticed the way she tucked a stray curl behind her ear when she was concentrating. She noticed the way his eyes, which she'd once thought were just a flat brown, held tiny flecks of gold. 3 weeks after they first met, it happened. They were playing a game. She would write a single word in her journal, and he had to guess it based on her clues. She'd been describing something beautiful, something peaceful. Sunset? He guessed, looking up from the boot he was polishing. She shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. No. Give me another hint. Blythe looked at him, really looked at him, at the way the lamplight carved shadows on his face, at the intensity in his golden, flecked eyes. Her heart started to pound, a frantic drum against her ribs. It's something, she said, her voice barely a whisper, that I didn't expect to find here. Breck put down the boot. He gave her his full attention. Something that surprised you? She nodded. Yes. Something worth fighting for. He moved then, crossing the small space between them in 2 silent strides. He knelt by her chair, his presence overwhelming. What word did you write, Blythe? He asked, his voice low and urgent. With a hand that trembled, she opened her journal. There, on the page, in her neat, careful script, was a single word. Home. The silence that followed was so profound he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He looked from the word to her face, and what he saw in her eyes made his breath catch. I've imagined you 1,000 ways, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could no longer contain. Since the first night, and in every single one, you end up carrying my child. The words struck her not like a whisper, but like a bolt of lightning. They were shocking, terrifying, and undeniably true. The air between them, already thick with unspoken feelings, now crackled with an unstoppable force. It was the point of no return. Breck, she breathed, his name a prayer on her lips. He reached up, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was electric. I know this is fast. I know you're inexperienced, but I can't stop thinking about it. About you. About this. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. I think about it too, she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Waking up next to you, not because we have to, but because we choose to. Having a family, growing old somewhere far away from everything. He framed her face with his hands, his gaze intense, searching. Is that what you want? She opened her eyes, and he saw his own desperate longing reflected there. Yes, she whispered, and then he kissed her. It was a gentle, questioning kiss at first, giving her every chance to pull away. But she didn't. She met his kiss with a fierce, pent-up passion that stunned them both. All the weeks of tension, of stolen glances and unspoken desires erupted in that single moment. He lifted her into his arms, and she wrapped hers around his neck, holding on as if she were drowning. The narrow bed, once their battlefield, became their haven. The dividing blanket was torn down and tossed aside. They came together with a raw, desperate need, 2 broken people trying to piece each other back together. He was gentle, patient, showing her a tenderness she never knew a man like him could possess. She was bold and trusting, giving him a part of herself she thought she'd never give to anyone. Later, lying tangled in the sheets, the moonlight painting silver stripes across their bodies, she traced the jagged scar on his wrist. Where did you get this? She asked softly. He tensed for a split second before relaxing, pulling her closer. A branding iron, he lied smoothly. Long time ago. Stupid accident. He kissed the top of her head, hiding his face in her hair. No regrets? He asked, changing the subject. None, she said, her voice firm. And she meant it. Whatever secrets he had, whatever dangers lay in her own past, in that moment, none of it mattered. They had found each other. They had found home. But home was a fragile thing, and their blissful peace was shattered just 2 weeks later, when a tall, imposing man in an expensive suit stepped off the morning train. His hair was silver, his face was cruel, and when Blythe saw him from the schoolhouse window, her blood ran cold. It was Harold Wickham. and he had come to collect his property. Wickham didn't waste any time. He strode directly to the schoolhouse, his polished shoes crunching on the dusty path. He saw Blythe standing in the doorway, her face pale, and a cold, satisfied smile spread across his lips. "Blythe, my dear," he said, his voice smooth and predatory. "Your little holiday is over. I've come to take you home." She stood her ground, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Mr. Wickham, there has been a misunderstanding. I have a job here. I'm not going back." He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "This childish rebellion is amusing, but it ends now. Your father sent me. He is very eager for our wedding to proceed." He took a step closer, his eyes raking over her. "You will be on the evening train with me." It was not a request. It was a command. "No," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I am not marrying you, ever." Wickham's smile vanished. His face became a cold, hard mask of fury. "You seem to misunderstand your position, my dear. Your father owes me a great deal of money. A debt so substantial it would ruin him, strip your family of everything they own. Our marriage is the only thing that cancels that debt." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You don't have a choice. You will marry me, or I will destroy your father, and then I will simply take what is mine anyway." The threat hung in the air, vile and suffocating. It wasn't just about money. It was about power, about punishment. He knew she had seen him that night. This was his way of ensuring her silence forever. She felt the walls of the trap closing in around her. Her freedom had been an illusion. I need to think," she stammered, backing away from him. "Of course," he said, his smile returning. He was enjoying her terror. "I've taken a room at the hotel. I will expect you there for dinner. Don't be late." He tipped his hat and walked away, as confident as a wolf that had just cornered its prey. Blythe stumbled back into the empty schoolhouse, the world spinning around her. She was trapped. There was no escape. That night, she didn't tell Breck the full truth. She couldn't. She couldn't tell him that Wickham was a murderer, that her life was in danger. She only told him about the debt, about the threat to her family. It was enough. He held her as she cried, his face a grim, stony mask. "I won't let him take you," he swore, his voice a low growl. "I'll find a way." Their lovemaking that night was different. It was fierce, desperate, a frantic clinging in the dark. It felt like a farewell. They held each other until the first hint of dawn, afraid that letting go would mean the end. When Blythe finally fell into an exhausted sleep, Breck slipped out of bed. He looked at her peaceful face, a terrible resolve hardening in his eyes. He scribbled a quick note and left it on his pillow. "Trust me. B." Then he was gone. When Blythe woke up, the space beside her was cold. The note was the only sign he had been there at all. A wave of pure, cold terror washed over her. Had he run? Had her problems become too much for him? Had he decided she wasn't worth the trouble? The thought was a physical pain, sharper than any fear of Wickham. She spent the day in a fog of dread, her students' voices a distant buzz. Where was he? What had he done? The answer arrived late that afternoon, in the form of Harold Wickham. He appeared at the schoolhouse door just as she was dismissing the last child. "Well?" he demanded, stepping inside. "Have you come to your senses?" Blythe lifted her chin, her heart hammering. If Breck was gone, if she was truly alone, she would face this herself. "I have," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "And my answer is no." Wickham's face turned a mottled, furious red. "You foolish girl! I am offering you a life of luxury, and you choose this hovel." "I choose freedom," she retorted. "You are offering me a prison. A prison you will gladly enter when your family is living on the street," he snarled, taking a menacing step toward her. "Her father's debt," a calm voice said from the doorway, "will be paid in full, by morning." They both spun around. Breck stood there, filling the doorway. He looked tired, dusty, but his eyes were clear and hard as steel. He walked into the room and stood beside Blythe, a solid, unmovable presence. Wickham let out a short, barking laugh. "Paid by whom? You, the penniless drifter?" "By me," Breck said again, his voice flat. "I just came from the telegraph office. I sent a message to an old friend in Denver, a man who's been holding some assets for me." He looked at Blythe, a silent message passing between them. "Turns out, I'm not as broke as I thought I was." This was the story they had agreed upon, the lie that would save them. He claimed he had cattle, a herd left with a friend that had grown over the years, a nest egg he'd forgotten about. The truth was far darker. The money wasn't from cattle. It was from a bank robbery in Dodge City. The money Veronica had framed him for stealing. He had managed to hide a portion of it before he fled, burying it deep in the ground miles outside of Willow Creek. Money he had sworn he would never, ever touch. Until now. Wickham's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "This is absurd. How much are we talking about?" $5,000, Breck said, without flinching. "It will be wired to the bank here tomorrow, more than enough to cover the debt with interest." The banker was stunned into silence. He opened and closed his mouth, searching for a flaw in the story. $5,000, he finally sputtered. "Even if that's true, what makes you think I'll accept blood money from a common cowboy?" Breck took a step forward. His hand didn't move toward his gun, but the threat was there, a coiled snake in the air between them. "Because if you don't," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "I will take out an ad in every newspaper from here to St. Louis. I'll tell them the story of the great Harold Wickham, the powerful banker who blackmails young women into marriage by threatening to destroy their families." He leaned in closer. "That kind of story, it's bad for business, isn't it?" The color drained from Wickham's face. He was trapped. A public scandal would be ruinous. He stared at Breck, then at Blythe, his eyes filled with pure hatred. He had been outmaneuvered. "This isn't over!" he snarled, jamming his hat onto his head. He turned and stormed out of the schoolhouse. "Yes," Blythe whispered, as the door slammed shut behind him. "It is." She turned to Breck, tears of relief and terror streaming down her face. "That money, it was all you had left, wasn't it?" "It was just money," he said, pulling her into a fierce, protective embrace. "He was going to destroy you. I couldn't let that happen." He held her tight, the weight of his secret, the feel of the dirty money, a heavy burden on his soul. "You're my life, Blythe. You're everything." The money arrived the next day, as promised. Wickham took it, his face a thundercloud, and left on the next train heading east. Their nightmare, it seemed, was over. That evening, Mrs. Murphy brought them a celebratory bottle of whiskey, her eyes twinkling. "Knew you two were meant for each other from the start," she said with a wink. Later, after she had gone to bed, Breck and Blythe sat in the quiet parlor. He turned to her, his expression serious. He slid off his chair and went down on one knee. He held out a small, simple gold band he had bought that afternoon. "Blythe Crowder," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not a rich man, and my past is complicated. But I love you. Will you marry me?" She was laughing and crying at the same time. "I thought you'd never ask," she whispered, holding out her hand. They were married 2 weeks later, in the same little church where they had fought over a wedding bouquet. The whole town came. It was a simple, beautiful ceremony. That night, they returned to room 7, the place that had been their prison, their battlefield, and their sanctuary. It was now their bridal suite. The circle was complete. 5 years later, Blythe Holloway stood on the porch of their ranch house, a gentle breeze stirring her hair. It wasn't a large ranch, but it was theirs, bought and built with hard work and the last of Breck's secret money. She watched her husband in the corral, patiently leading a small pony. On its back, sitting straight and proud, was their son, Colin, 4 years old, with his father's dark hair and her own green eyes. "Look, Mama!" Colin shouted, his voice filled with pure, childish joy. "I'm doing it!" Breck walked alongside him, his hand hovering near his son's back, ready to catch him, but not holding on. He was letting him find his own balance. He looked up at Blythe on the porch and smiled, a real, unguarded smile that still made her heart skip a beat. The years had been good, but they hadn't been easy. They lived with a constant, low-level fear of the past catching up to them. Every stranger who rode into town, every unexpected letter, was a potential threat. Their happiness was a beautiful, fragile thing, built on a foundation of secrets and lies. Blythe rested a hand on her stomach, where their second child was quietly growing. They had created this life together, a world of their own making, far from Dodge City and St. Louis. They had found their home. That night, as they sat on the porch swing after Colin was asleep, she leaned her head on his shoulder. The stars were scattered like diamonds across the black velvet sky. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked softly. "The money?" Breck's arm tightened around her. "I think about the fact that it saved you. That's all that matters." "I thought you were just some wild cowboy that first night," she mused, a smile in her voice. "Dangerous and unpredictable." He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Was I wrong?" "No," she whispered, tilting her head up to kiss him. "You were exactly what I needed." They had imagined each other 1,000 ways in that little room, two broken souls running from their pasts. They had imagined a future that seemed impossible, but they had fought for it. They had lied for it. They had built it, piece by piece, under the vast, watchful sky of the West. Their love story wasn't a fairy tale. It was something far more real, more powerful. It was a story of survival. In the distance, a coyote called out to the moon, a lonely, wild sound that echoed across the prairie. It was a reminder that the world was still a dangerous place, full of shadows and secrets. But here, on this small patch of land, in the circle of each other's arms, they were safe. They were home. If this story of two strangers who fought for their future kept you on the edge of your seat, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the strange and mysterious tales we have coming next.